Good evening and welcome to the Newshour Agenda. I'm Madhavdas G. Viewers, Europe has rallied behind Ukraine after President Zelensky's ugly spat with US President Donald Trump at the Oval Office. However, after the tense scenes, now Zelensky has sought to dial down tensions. Accused of not being thankful to the United States, Zelensky shared a video message in which he's expressed gratitude to the US for all the support the war-torn country has received. Listen in.
Звісно, ми усвідомлюємо важливість Америки, і ми вдячні за всю підтримку, яку ми отримали від Сполучених Штатів Америки. Не було такого дня, щоб ми не відчували тієї вдячності, бо це вдячність за збереження нашої незалежності. Наша стійкість в Україні, вона базується на тому, що роблять заради нас, і заради власної безпеки.
Meanwhile, Kremlin issued its first response to the Zelensky-Trump heated exchange, saying this shows how difficult the path to settlement is. The statement added that Zelensky is once again proven Trump right and that Moscow's willingness to settle issues have been hampered by Kyiv's reluctance. But most of Europe is solidly standing behind Ukraine. European leaders gathered in London yesterday to reinforce support for Ukraine and draft a ceasefire plan. UK Prime Minister Starmer announced that Britain, France and Ukraine have agreed to draft a ceasefire plan to present to the United States. Italy emphasized on the need for the West to stay united. But the big question is, what next? What if the United States pulls out support? Will the European Union then be enough to support it in this event?
You're watching the News Hour at 10, debate number 1, on Times Now, Super Prime Time.
For more on this, let's go across to our panel of guests. Joining us is Kurt Volker, former United States Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations and former U.S. Ambassador to NATO. Also with us is Emine Zaparova, who's a former First Deputy Foreign Minister of Ukraine. Joining us on the show also is Dr. Erik Solheim, a former Under-Secretary General of the UN and former Norwegian Minister. Kawal Sibal, former Foreign Secretary, joins us on the show as well. Let me start first and foremost with you. Emine Zaparova, after what has transpired, in Washington, D.C., of course, those images have gone viral over the weekend. The sort of verbal sparring that we saw between President Trump, Vice President Vance and President Zelensky. Now we have seen him come around to make noises as though he understands the importance of America. But, is that really going to be enough? How are we going to see matters resolved? There's a lot of pressure being built up from the side of the EU. But in the absence of security guarantees that President Zelensky is seeking, how really are we looking at the possibility of peace becoming a reality?
Namaste to all of people of India, and let me take first of all the opportunity to congratulate people of India with Mahashivaratri, the holy night that Hindus have been celebrating, and people and Muslims of India with the holy month of Ramadan. Going back, dear anchor, to your question, I would say that it was a really a catastrophic accident that happened during the negotiations between two leaders. I also have my own conclusions that might coincide with millions of Ukrainians, that we, first of all and mainly, want to see the essence of any negotiation that should come to the peace. Point number 1 is that people of Ukraine, probably, and the nation of Ukraine and the country of Ukraine is the only country that wants peace. Moreover, and most of all other people, Ukraine is interested in that peace. The other thing, I believe that during that meeting, one iron rule has been broken. You can never be guided by your emotions. So I believe that this is something that went wrong, and I honestly and strongly believe that whenever two leaders are speaking, there is no room for others to comment, and this might also be the hitting thing. So now what would happen, and I believe that this is exactly when the diplomacy should start working, because catastrophes might happen, accidents might happen, but then the other actions and diplomacy should jump in. So number 1 issue is that Ukrainian diplomacy, I believe, will focus on trying to bring European allies. This is what, by the way, President Trump is trying to motivate European countries to be much more active in terms of everything, military support, in terms of economic support. So the European Union is unfortunately in crisis, and we can see that. And the Ukrainian issue is a litmus paper. But I believe that there is still room for better coordination among EU countries, and I think that they should jump in. Otherwise,
in fact, they have. I think about 21 of the countries have expressed their support to Ukraine. I think that's out there in the public domain. But let me bring in Dr. Erik Solheim on that note. Dr. Erik Solheim, while we have virtually all of EU coming together, and we have seen the kind of noises coming in that, we can all come together, we can protect militarily. We have 2.6 million soldiers, if I have the number correctly, to defend Ukraine. So the EU is coming together. But does that really have a lot of meaning unless the United States also is part of the process of guaranteeing security? Because there are many who believe that, what Russia has done in the last 3 years is something that they can do anytime in the future, unless there are some solid guarantees coming in from the side of not just the EU, but also of the United States.
Europe is in a very difficult spot, in my view. It has of course, wasted its time over the last 2 years, believing that it can just depend on an alliance with the United States of America. It has done little or nothing to build alliances with India, with China, and with other nations in the global south, which will put it in a stronger position. And it has really not developed a plan for peace. And I think that was the most visible thing in the meeting between Trump and Zelenskyy. I mean, I, as all Europeans, definitely disliked the way Vance and Trump treated Zelenskyy. It was not acceptable and should not have happened with TV cameras on. But Zelenskyy came into the meeting not with a peace plan, not even with a desire for peace, but with any number of excuses for why we cannot go to a ceasefire now. And in wars, I've been in different ways involved in many wars as a peacemaker. You need either of two. Either you have a plan for a military victory, or you have a plan to resist and then at the end ultimately end up with negotiations and peace. And Ukraine cannot win. I don't think many Ukrainians even believe they can win. Then they must have a plan for a negotiated peace. And a negotiated peace can unfortunately only happen with Mr. Putin. They may not like him, but only Putin can be the partner in peace. And then Zelenskyy need to talk to Putin. And at the moment, Trump is the only person who can make that happen.
Right. Along with that, let me bring in fact, Kurt Volker. Kurt Volker, we've seen, of course, the kind of, there are multiple reactions as to what has transpired in the Oval Office. There are those who say that perhaps Zelenskyy was wrong. There are those who say that President Trump and Vice President Vance also were perhaps, pushing him towards the edge. At the end of the day, perhaps, his emotions got the better of him, is what Emine just said a short while ago. But, this is what you have Francis Macron saying. He says, we have an overarmed and aggressive Russia on our border. It is carrying out terrorist actions and massive disinformation campaigns here and in Europe. If Putin's not stopped, he will certainly move on to Moldova and perhaps beyond to Romania. So are these very real fears that are being expressed? And if the United States leaves the EU to its own devices, what is the possibility of what can happen on ground in Europe at this point of time? There's a lot of speculation and a lot of concern within Europe itself.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And let me first say to your question, yes, those are very real fears. Vladimir Putin has been very open about his desire to eliminate Ukraine as a nation state, eliminate their sovereignty and independence, and have them subordinate to Russia. And he's also said that he is seeking to rebuild the Russian Empire. He has compared himself to Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. And that means taking over the territory of still other countries that also used to be part of the Russian Empire, including Moldova, including perhaps the Baltic states. So these are very real fears. As for where things go, I completely agree with Emine. We have to get beyond the emotions and get back to focusing on interests. And this is what nations and leaders of nations are supposed to do. They should think about what are the risks, what are the opportunities, how do we work together to address them? And I think that everything that was true before Friday's meeting is still true today. The U.S., Europe, and Ukraine have a shared interest in stopping Russia's aggression and stabilizing peace in Europe for the long term. And we've got to work together to do that.
Right. No, but before I go across to Kamal Sibal, I also want to understand from you, sir, what is your perspective? You're someone who's a seasoned diplomat, and the optics of, a country which has had a certain position. It's one thing to be flexible when it comes to foreign policy, but pivoting 180 degrees, and, the kind of statements that have been there, trying to sort of warm up to Russia, but at the same time, the kind of treatment that has been given to a country that is supposed to be in a strategic partnership with you, with the United States, that's bound to raise some serious questions about how dependable the United States is as an ally.
Well, yes, you're absolutely right. Those questions are being raised all over Europe and in Ukraine. But ultimately, as Mr. Solheim said, we need the United States to be part of any final arrangements here. It's not enough Europe alone. We all have to be in this together. And I think what President Zelensky missed when he had his meeting in the Oval Office was that President Trump is trying to do some very difficult things all at the same time. He's trying to get Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table and get him to agree to a ceasefire at a time when Putin thinks he can continue the war. He's trying to get an economic arrangement with Ukraine that puts our aid to Ukraine on a sustainable basis. $100 billion over the last year or so is spent out of U.S. taxpayer money. It's not the kind of thing we can do forever. So we needed a kind of business arrangement. That's what the minerals deal was meant to do, to create a vehicle for that. And then thirdly, he's trying to make sure that we put in place enough force, enough capability that Putin doesn't attack again. And he wants Europe to take the lead in that. So it's not just the United States doing that. He wants Europe to lead in that.
Right.
A very complex picture to try to put together. And I think by insisting on security guarantees right up front in the meeting, in front of the cameras, knowing that that is not where Trump is today. It's not what the meeting was about. I think it was a mistake, and it set the meeting off the rails. But we can still get back to that if cooler heads prevail.
All right. Kamal Sibal, is there really any getting back to where we were before a Friday after all that has happened and all the river that has flown down the Potomac since? India particularly is watching this very closely because we have close ties with the US, with Russia, with Ukraine and with the EU. And all of these developments at the end of the day in a globalized world have their own impact on a country such as India. Mr. Sibal.
Yes, of course. But we've gone through a very difficult phase after Russia had this military operation in 2022. And that's when the global South was extremely worried about the consequences on the ground for them, whether it was oil prices or fertilizers or wheat shipments or whatever. And India played a major role in terms of reaching out to the global South, understanding the concerns, conveying them to President Putin. And in the G20, as you know, we played a very important role in making sure that the G20 didn't collapse as a group and that there could be some compromise over Ukraine. So we've gone through a very, very difficult phase already. So what is happening today is not as dramatic as it was when initially the situation began to go out of hand. Now, with Trump, the situation has changed drastically because he has reached out to Russia. Earlier on, the United States was not willing to talk to Russia at all. Now he's reached out to Russia. He thinks he can trust up to a certain extent Putin and can deal with him. He's been saying that repeatedly. He has said something which no other US president has said before, that NATO was a trigger for the situation that has happened in Ukraine, which means that the entire narrative that the whole situation was unprovoked has been rejected by President Trump. Furthermore, he has said that the issue is much larger. He wants to put the resolution of the Ukraine conflict within the larger framework of a progressive normalization of US-Russia relationship, which will then go into other areas, including disarmament and everything else, and mutual trade and lifting of sanctions and investments in Russia and everything else. So therefore, he says, to begin with, he will talk to Russia, set the base for some common understanding in which a situation the solution to the situation in Ukraine can be embedded.
Right.
Now, you're saying, no, we can't be left out. Ukraine says we cannot be left out. So there is a big difference in the strategy of the two countries, and I see some merit in what Trump is trying to do.
Certainly.
Of course, the Americans put it rather strongly, saying that you've had 3 years. He tells Europe, you've had 3 years to solve this, and therefore why do you want to be a part of the negotiations, etc., etc. And there is a bad blood between Trump and Zelensky. I mean, I can go into all that, and everybody on the panel knows what this is.
Absolutely.
And therefore, in my mind, Zelensky totally mishandled the situation. He should have known what the background was, and he should not have been argumentative. He could have said what he wanted to say, frankly, and behind, when they went in for talks behind the scenes, not in front of the press. But he started challenging Trump and Vance, and then they reacted.
Well, was the provocation from Zelensky's side, Trump's side? In fact, there are those who say that perhaps Zelensky should have offered President Trump the opportunity of building a Trump Tower there in Kyiv, and that would have changed things. But nevertheless, that apart, if I can bring in Eric Solheim. Eric Solheim, this is what the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has said. He has said that when he's talking about the European peacekeepers in Ukraine, he says that they want to prop up Zelensky with their bayonets in the form of peacekeeping units. So very clearly, Russia appears to be very, very skeptical of whatever is being proposed at this point of time by the EU. How do you see the Russians coming around in that context?
As long as Europe, or for that matter Ukraine, is not really indicating what they will achieve through a peace, of course Russia has a free pass. They can make any comment, and they can just sit down and let these TV dramas play out, like between Mr. Zelensky and Trump. I think we now should focus on what a peace deal will mean, because I believe basically the contours of a peace deal is open for everyone to see. It will mean, number one, freezing the present situation at the front, which of course will have the very unfortunate negative consequence that part of what was Ukraine will be under Russian control. But it will be done in such a way that it's not to Ukraine to accept that as a final outcome, but that will be the present situation, freezing. That's exactly the same what happened in Korea in 1953, led by Eisenhower.
Right.
Secondly, Ukraine will demand security guarantees because they don't trust Putin. That's understandable. Those security guarantees can be American military power. They can also be, to some extent, European military power, but they can also be a lot more. Why don't Europe ask China, India, but also the global south to contribute? I mean, they cannot send forces which would fight with Putin, but they can, if they are involved in a peacemaking deal, sending observers or peacemakers. It would be much, much more difficult for Putin to break such a deal. And finally, the alternative to this peace is 2, 3, 4, 5, no one knows, more years of war. And I have heard no one who believe that Ukraine will be in a better negotiating position 3 years down the line than they are now. So time for trying to make this very, very difficult peace. The time is now.
Okay, Emine, I want to bring you in on one aspect, because it's not like, I mean, while the overwhelming majority of the European countries, EU, are of course strongly backing Ukraine, there are others such as Italy who said that we've got to sit down at the negotiating table. In fact, this is what Prime Minister Meloni says. I think it's very, very important that we avoid the risk that the West divides. On this, UK and Italy can play an important role in bridge building. But that bridge building perhaps, or that consensus making, is something that is going to take quite some time to bring the US back on that negotiating table. How quickly do you think this can actually take place?
I don't think that it would be very quickly. I really want to again bring you back to the essence of any negotiation that should take place. I think that the core and the ground for any talk should be international law. We should not forget about international law, and this should be a kind of a guarantee that there are rules that we have all committed to. And when we talk about the ceasefire or about those, let's say, negotiations, which are appeasing negotiations in a way, because Putin obviously doesn't want to have a peace deal, and Mr. Kutwalker also said that the ultimate goal of Russia is to restore the empire by destroying Ukraine and the Ukrainian statehood. So if we are clear and honest to each other, can we say that Russia is ready to follow the international law? Of course not. So any deal that would be there, it will be a temporary deal. It would not be a sustainable deal. What I think that within a year or half a year, there will be a turbulence between US and Ukraine. I think that Ukrainian diplomacy will try to put European countries on board to a bigger extent than they are today. I think that Europe is in crisis and is not capable of responding truly and in a full extent to the crisis that we have. And this thing is not about the Ukrainian conflict. Let me again tell you that when 2014 happened, there was no NATO conversation in Ukrainian narrative. It didn't kind of help us and Putin attacked us. There was still an appeasing language. So my logic says that whenever aggression is not stopped, it becomes bigger.
Okay.
So if we keep on appeasing aggressor today and just on the coast or on the merit of Ukraine and having any deal whatsoever on the table, and let us imagine that we can have any deal.
Well, I mean, all I can say is that diplomacy is the art of making things possible, and a lot of effort from the United States to the United Kingdom, some dramatic scenes that we've seen over the last weekend, and one certainly hopes that at the end of the day, as the Prime Minister said, peace prevails. India's on the side of peace. We have a very clear position. Will that happen? How elusive will it be? What really is at stake? A lot indeed if you look at what's happened over the last 3 years. Kurt Volker, Eminate Zaparova, Dr. Eric Solheim, Kamal Sibal, and to thank all of you for joining us with your perspectives this evening.